Welcome to another Propagandacast Total War video, another little sort of lecturing on the matters of Total War, in this case discussing faction types. That is, we got a lot of factions, but overall these sort of fall into about three larger categories. You might say, well, there's about six here, but largely still within these three. You've got basically the Barbarian Kingdoms, which involves mostly all of these gentlemen. The Norsemen as well, yes, I know, they've got their own category, but they're basically the other guys, just with more axes and better ships, more or less. Also, less other bits, for example, less crossbows, but overall pretty much the same in sort of terms of how they function as a faction. The Great Migrators are sort of a in-between between the Barbarian Kingdoms, these two gentlemen, but also between the sort of more nomadic, and so can switch, and by the way, Barbarian Kingdoms can by the way also become, well, nomadic if necessary, so little fun fact there, but overall these start out as more nomadic, and these are, I believe, permanently nomadic. So of course there are some small details there, and then you finally got the empires here. Of course there are some smaller variation between, West, East, Rome, and of course also the Sassanid Empire, but again they sort of largely run on the same tendency and sort of the same idea and concepts. So I mean, of course I'll just be going into sort of further detail with them. I mean, not just sort of talking from here, but sort of more directly displaying it in game. So let's have first look here at the Barbarian Kingdoms. So, Barbarian Kingdoms, what is it that makes these factions tick? Well, overall it tends to be sort of, I would say the term is, well, generalization and decentralization. Of course, I mean, that's going to sort of be further explained, once you look at the empires. But in general, they sort of have the ability to basically recruit a lot of their troops from basically anywhere. They don't, for example, have a specific military building. You build up a farm, for example, you can all of a sudden get access to a lot of your things. For example, right here we got skirmishers, you built some pastures, you get access to cavalry, for example. It's already there, just by building a lot of things, you all of a sudden unlock a lot of things. For example, here again, you set up some industry, and that further unlocks new and fanciful troops. So that is also an additional little detail there to sort of keep in mind. And again, that is very much something that rules the Barbarian Kingdoms. And it also ensures that basically they can very quickly recruit a sort of large plethora of units. I mean, they can quickly have cavalry, archers, crossbowmen, skirmishers, assault infantry, and so on. Of course, I mean, they're not necessarily always the best. For example, these Nordic band, which are part of the Saxons, but also, the northern kingdoms up there are not exactly the world's best men. In fact, they're pretty goddamn terrible. But of course, again, then something you have to do, and again, sometimes, of course, they then sort of have to sort of slowly improve, and then they actually sort of become notably better as you progress through your technology tree. So those are, for example, also things there as well. And that's also then something they very much depend upon. Basically, they don't really unlock new troops most in case. In fact, most troops that unlock basically happen mostly down here. We sort of need to get more special buildings that sort of unlock more elite troops that otherwise would not be available to you as the player. But that again is more flexible. It also means you can't really specialize to a certain degree, and it also means, for example, your economic buildings don't quite necessarily have the same punch. I mean, again, they sort of have to fulfill a lot more roles. Of course, they can't quite, for example, get you the quite full economic benefit either. So there's a bit sort of more of a trick there to sort of manage with, and of course you'll need more with them. At the same time, they're less concerned if you're actually in a city or you're out in the province. I mean, you can, for example, right here, build in theory, you can go walk down to Rome, take it, and this, what Rome really needs? No, what does Rome really need, Clovis? Goats. Goats, Alaric. Rome really needs goats. And then you build up a goat farm inside of Rome. Basically. So in that regard, it is a lot more decentralized. Of course, there are more specialized buildings within the 6 cities, sort of more marketplaces, specialized sort of for more, research and the likes, and some other bits. But overall, there's not that huge of a difference there between, the city and the countryside when it comes to the Barbarian Kingdoms. So it's very much something to keep in mind. There's also sort of the infrastructure here. In terms of what bonuses are, they sort of tend to sort of be more, about personal lordship. They tend to sort of be more about gaining more economic gain. In particular, the early ones. They also gave you sort of a, personal bonus for the commander, but for example, it's not overall, military benefits you're getting here. In fact, it's mostly, economic. As you get higher up, though, there will be a bit more, for it as you sort of hit the higher tiers. There'll be a bit there, but overall, for the Barbarian Kingdom, sort of the lower here of the officers and the ranks, it's more, economically benefiting the entire faction. So that's a little detail there to keep in mind as well when it comes to these Barbarian Kingdoms. Dun, dun, duh. If you can overall keep that in mind again, you sort of get the impression of what the Barbarian Kingdoms are and how they sort of work. I mean, they can very quickly sort of build up a lot rapidly, get a very varied force very rapidly, and sort of go to war with the enemy with that. Of course, they might not quite immediately have super strength or sort of high durability, but they can usually pull off a lot of tricks initially compared to, say, maybe some of their opponents. Of course, at the same time, you can't quite specialize to the same degree. You can't, for example, get the best equipment for them in. And of course, again, in terms of economy, you will certainly be struggling a bit at times, and so need to be a bit more careful planning, because again, you can't quite sort of hit the same levels of specialization as the empires can. But if you can keep that in mind, again, you'll sort of get to the grips with it, and of course realize again this is a very sort of military-oriented faction as the Barbarian Kingdoms. So I think that rather covers it. Of course, I might have missed a few things in there, but I think that sort of largely covers it. So let's move on, shall we? Now, for the Migrators, the Nomads, and so on, for example, the game is a bit more different, in particular for the Huns, of course, to sort of stand out more, so the more specific ones. Again, they don't really share any of the traits of the Barbarian Kingdoms at all, for example, so they tend to be more specific. For example, their command structure will tend to be sort of more focused towards combat and a bit the hordes, but overall combat. So those are sort of some things that, high up, for example, there's a bit more sort of there in terms of economy, but that's really it. But overall, for hordes overall, which you can all share, basically, your army is your city. That's something very much important to keep in mind. It also means, basically, if you lose the army, you lose the city, you lose actually a vital part of your sort of war machine, because, again, the army very much is the spot that produces your equipment as well, for example. You have, for example, to sort of switch between different points. You can, for example, not quite do as much with them either. For example, some armies can, do ambushes and fortify. There's not really that here. Basically, what you can do is, well, in camp, which I suppose is a bit the same as fortifying, but overall, that's where you then basically sort of begin building up and training troops. Because you can't do it while you're on the move. You can hire mercenaries, but you can't really do anything beyond that. Your structures, of course, also then sort of a bit more, I should say, general, if you will. Again, they don't quite have the sort of high levels of expertise, because partly, again, you're a largely nomadic force. Of course, you can then sort of switch around how much food you get depending on what regions you're sort of actually possessing. So, of course, there's a little something there in it for you. On the other hand, one thing to keep in mind is they're a bit more focused military-wise compared to, the Barbarian Kingdoms, for example. You don't build a farm and get some troops there. You need to build more specific ones. So that's also something to keep in mind. Of course, they also got more space in each horde there, of course, to sort of build buildings, as you might sort of be casually noting. So there's a bit more to go on there. But again, you sort of want to try and sort of switch things together, sort of get a decent amount of economy. And of course, another thing to keep in mind, if you're playing as one of the Barbarian Kingdoms, migrating and sort of settling down, you will lose everything you have there. So to a certain extent, unless you're really sort of intent on sticking to it, you want to be careful about not getting up too far into it. Otherwise, you're very much going to hurt yourself economically. And of course, in terms of creating more of armies or hordes, you don't just raise them. You sort of split things up, and that way create a new horde. So that also creates a sort of moment of weakness for you as well. For example, a quick strike could actually do a lot of damage to you. But again, it does also mean you have one advantage. You only have your armies to worry about. You don't have to worry about cities or defending. I mean, you just have to worry about them, so that does create some interesting momentum as well, as you're going to be harder to pin down in some regards. I know, like regards, you're probably going to be easier to pin down. So of course that's also something very vital to keep in mind. Of course, something that'll do you quite a bit of good if you sort of handle it correctly. But again, very much has its weakness. Again, you lose one army. Again, you also lose a city, and that's going to hurt you quite a bit. So of course it is very much not without its slight problems and potential issues that could happen to you if you're not careful with it. And certainly, it might in some regards be probably the more trickier ones to sort of handle, in particular as the Huns and Gems. Absolutely no method there for settling down. But again, proper handling of things will do you quite a bit of good, and should give you quite a bit of strength, if that is your thing anyways. Personally, it's not quite my thing, but of course that varies from player to player. But overall, again, it's going to be sort of with the Huns marauding, well, forcing people to subject to you, and overall just carrying on. So I think that sort of rather covers nomads, and migrating hordes, sort of the strengths and weaknesses there as well. And again, you know, what you can do with them. So let's move on to the empires, the last part here. And here we are finally, the empires. The last sort of major type here, faction. Of course, there'll always be sort of the differences between the factions themselves. For example, there are some notable differences between the Sassanids and the Romans, and the Western and the Eastern Romans, but I think that's more of a larger discussion for another time, if that is, of course, what people want. But overall with the empires, I mean, you already sort of got an idea when they talked about the Barbarian Kingdoms. The empires are much more specialised. That means militarily as well. Most of their military is basically sort of focused more into barracks and the likes. You hire your troops there. You don't hire them, for example, from the pig farm, camel farm, or whatever. You get them there and you don't get them elsewhere. It also means to a certain extent, you know, their forces can be a lot harder to sort of, you know, fold out and bloom in a sense. I mean, they have to sort of really research and get access to sort of more unit types, for example, which does limit their ability. In particular, the Romans suffer from that, whereas with the Sassanids, there's a bit more to work on there already from the beginning. With the Romans, it's a much more slower progress to sort of get anywhere, and you sort of have to rely on your most basic infantry for some time, depending on how things work out. Of course, at the same time, you do also have the potential for more economic development and overall sort of more specialization within towns and regions. Of course, at the same time, there's also a sharper divide between city and town. I mean, for example, you can't build anything out in here. For example, you could build out there, and vice versa. But of course, at the same time, you can sort of get farms that have much more of an impact economically compared to, for example, the other farms of the Barbarian Kingdoms or the Hordes, which of course can also mean you can, for example, also get more food if you handle things correctly. Same with military, of course. They might not quite sort of look impressive right off as things go on. They do provide a bit more, though they can always be a bit expensive, but they can also provide a bit of a garrison in their own right. So in that regard, you know, they do offer a bit more punch as things go on. Plus, they can also sort of get more structure specialized sort of upgrading, and thus can actually offer higher tiers of upgrades for troops, unlike the Barbarian Hordes, which can't quite get there at all. Research-wise, they can also do a bit more. Of course, with the Sassanids, you know, there's even, you know, a distinction between rural and urban infantry and troop training overall there. So there are some details there. Tech-wise, of course, it's sort of, you know, part again, you're sort of upgrading to the ultimate extent, you know, working towards unlocking new troop types. So, of course, that's also a bit of a difference there between the empires. Also, research-wise, it's also to some extent also more about, you know, fighting corruption and the likes, in particular for the Roman empires, which rather suffer heavily on that. In terms of structure, in terms of, you know, the command structure, it's much more militarily oriented and sort of about dealing with upkeep and recruitment costs and the like. There might be at the higher tiers a bit there, sort of make other things a bit more, you know, helpful, but overall for the empires, the hierarchy here is very much militarily oriented, which is also a good thing to keep in mind, and again does sort of also highlight where things are going. So again, much more specialized. Also, another difference, I probably should have mentioned that again, you know, always sort of little fun thing to keep for the mind, last part. With the Barbarian Kingdoms, you create tribute states. That is, they pay a tribute, You can hire troops from them, but overall you can't severely drag them into a war. You can't really do much with them. With the empires, on the hand, you create puppet states. They are very much under your control, unless, of course, they rebel because they didn't want to join a war. So they will basically force you to join into wars with you if you want. So you can basically sort of overall swing a much bigger hammer in a sense than the Barbarian Kingdoms, in particular. Then sort of pick up a lot of puppet states here and there. And of course, you also get money from them. In fact, the Sassanids gain bonuses from having lots of puppet states. So little fun facts there as well. But overall, I think that rather covers it. Again, you know, empires, much more specialized. Does also mean, of course, they're sort of a bit slow to sort of get really going in some departments. But on the other hand, once they get going, they do offer a lot more impact. Of course, to a certain extent, again, it also requires more specialization. And for example, you can't, really get a lot of, for example, all of the units in one province. You really have to sort of spread it out over several provinces. Unless you're sort of basically realizing, okay, this province is not going to work economically, I'm just going to turn it into a military province, in which case, of course, you can do that. But even then, for example, it's still going to be focused in one province. For example, it's not again with the Barbarian Kingdoms, where it can pretty much be guaranteed you can always get some kind of troop you need in pretty much every province you own. So, of course, those are little details there to keep in mind. But overall, I think that covers it. Of course, questions can be made in the comments if there's something I was unclear on. I'll, of course, try to explain there. But overall, this has hopefully been helpful to you. A bit unsure as to the differences between the sort of factions overall, and sort of how they play and which one you might sort of consider choosing. So thank you all for watching, and hope to see you again another time. This is Imperial Dane saying cheers.